Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Langa. I am a PhD student at the Sociology Department of Uppsala University and part of the Seedbot project as well from the beginning. So what I'm going to present here today is the state of the art in regards to my dissertation project, which is ramping up towards my final seminar at the beginning of next year. So, my dissertation project is about the moral valuation of nature and the different modes of valuations in Swedish urban gardening practice. And I arrived at this idea by reading through the literature on urban gardening and finding that there is a sort of acceptance or sort of inherent acceptance of the inherent goodness of gardening. There's a lot of reflection and a lot of work towards explaining why gardening is good, and less about how this goodness is constructed. So my project actually is looking at precisely that process of valuation that remains kind of ignored mostly in the literature on urban gardening. To do this, I turned to John Dewey's theory of valuation, of moral valuation. And Dewey's theory of valuation is, what is that? The planes, okay. Anyways, so John Dewey's theory of valuation relies on the premise on a critique of the distinction between means and ends of action. So he criticizes this from the point of view of viewing action as a creative, continuous process. Therefore, ends are always only identifiable as reflections in before action or after action, right? So we either identify a set of end goals before we start on a path of action, or we identify ends after we have certain conclusions or certain consequences of our actions. We identify them as ends. So there is a continuum between ends and means of action. Now, this has consequences in terms of considering valuation. Why? Because then it means that ends don't have the monopoly on value, on intrinsic value. So the distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value becomes kind of meaningless, right? So in this framework, then Dewey distinguishes between a form of action that can be understood as play, a form of action that can be understood as work. So play action is autotelic action, where one action creates the consequences or the possibilities of the following action, and it perpetuates itself in its creative process. And work is when we have a distant end in view that we imagine, that we project into the future, and we determine a set of procedural means. However, this doesn't mean that each procedural mean creates conditions of possibility. That means that we reevaluate what the ends are and reassess. So in his view, means have intrinsic value as well, because we cannot separate the consideration of ends or the rightness or the goodness of an end without considering and evaluating the means to achieve that end. So in this theory, every course of action is thus a creative process in which value is produced and transferred. So I take this theory as expanded by Stefan Barger in his study of bird protection in Germany and the UK, with two extra concepts. The first one is the conception of flow. Flow is essentially the psychological experience of play. When you're engaging in an autotelic form of action, in an action conceived as play, you experience a sense of flow of your action. If you think about the most simple example, would be playing a game of tennis where you hit a ball, prompts the other person to hit a ball, and there's a flow of action until it's interrupted. And Barger introduces a concept of game, which is the institutionalized rules of that constrict or enable the flow of play. So for my dissertation, I understand urban gardening as a form of play, but also considering so as a creative process of action that creates its own drive forwards as a practice. And but I also consider the experience of flow, particularly in relation to aesthetic experience, understood not only as a sort of the making of aesthetic judgments in regards to the look of gardens, but also in the sensoriality aspect of the practice itself. And I also consider the rules of the game in terms of what does particularly the urban context, how does the urban context and the normative framework and the historical context of the practice as it is happening today in Sweden has consequences on the practice as play, enabling or constricting play. Well, first of all, what I've found is that there is a great deal of economic value being constructed for urban gardening today in Sweden. On the one side, you have a process of professionalization, where gardening is becoming more, gardening and farming is becoming more and more an election profession, or as a way of applying a set of skills learned in, for example, architecture or design schools. And this is the way I see urban gardening being institutionalized currently in Sweden. It's not turning towards what happened before with allotment gardens, the koloniträdgården, trädgårdar or odlingslotter, as it happened historically, turning into these bigger national organizations that regulate and organize the activity. Instead, these new urban gardens are institutionalized towards the direction of economic valuations of the practice in the form of professionalization, but also in the direct production of economic value through the produce being produced in urban farms, right? So, however, what is very, very clear is that the economic value being created is relying on the grounds of a moral valuation of the practice of gardening and organic farming as inherently good kind of practice that we need to promote and we need to invest in and we need to develop and we need to support by purchasing these products and so on and so forth. But not only that, but also in an idea of naturalness, right? And this is evident in the way, for example, some urban farmers need to find ways of conveying the naturalness of their work to their customers, because their customers are searching for that value, the value of the organic history or the organic story of the products they're taking to their tables. So they tell this story through explaining their work in their websites, but also by inviting customers to harvest the produce themselves. But in this way, communicating this value that is rooted where? Well, it's rooted in, I argue, and the aesthetic aspect of the valuation, the moral valuation of nature in the practice of gardening. That is at the core of the experience of flow in gardening practice. First of all, there is a set of experiences that may not be considered pleasant or enjoyable, right? But as Dewey presents in his consideration or description of what play is, play action is not defined by whether people enjoy something or not, but whether the activity is its own drive forward, right? Its own logic of perpetuation. And in this sense, there are, for example, a lot of aspects of the aesthetic experience of gardening that are not exactly pleasant, being bitten by mosquitoes, the smell of manure, or being dirty with soil all the time. And in gardeners' experience, this is framed and understood as actually being in connection with something that is real. So the uncomfortableness of the experience of gardening is understood as part of the experience of nature, of something that is real. Something that is real needs to also be somewhat uncomfortable, right? And this fits into narratives about how we are over-civilized, for example, right? And that we are afraid of bacteria, afraid of dirt, and live in these clean bubbles. And therefore, by connecting with dirt and soil and all the uncomfortable, if you want, aspects of nature, we're connecting with something that is real. And on the other hand, there is this experience of gardening as that is connected with that work as being something that is a work that is unambiguously good. And why is it interpreted as being unambiguously good? Well, on the one hand, it's because there is a clear effect, right? An interviewee compared it to her experience of working as a social worker in Sweden for many, many years. She said, well, you never know how much good you're doing. It's so difficult to see any real effect from your work. However, I go to my garden and then you plow for an hour and you see the results. This is my little gardening plot, by the way. That was done in one afternoon, right? So you enter a flow where, pulling out one weed is satisfactory enough that gets you to pull out another weed, and you can see how that makes a difference. No? So on the one hand, it's that, and on the other, it's this idea of this experience of being fostering life, of being relating, finding a way of relating to nature, and finding a position for oneself, and by extension humanity, in organic processes that instead of being harmful is fostering life, right? And that's why the absolutely most important element of value aspect of gardening was composting and bringing life back to the soil, right? And the idea of autotelic experience of action also gets translated into the temporality of the experience of gardening. Why? And because it's a process that can be extended into the future without any interruptions, right? There is no reason why if you do organic gardening right, that you're going to deplete the soil or that you're not going to be able to garden in that place forever, indefinitely, right? So gardeners understood that there is an apocalyptic future coming. There was no doubt that the apocalypse is going to come, but gardening in a way is a way of practicing and playing at experiencing the apocalypse and experiencing what we are going to have to do to face environmental destruction. So in a way, this is giving us valuations about in space and scale, because caring for the soil translated into caring for the earth, right? And all of this is constructed to be very emplaced kind of valuation. Doesn't it sound like that? Yes? Nod? Yes? So since we're talking about the soil and protecting the productivity of the soil and in constructing and continuing to nourish the soil, one would think that it would be a very place-based value for gardens. However, when we come into a quite interesting situation when we look at the urban context and the game aspect that I mentioned in the beginning, right? What are the rules of the game? Well, the rules of the game in the urban context means that land and urban space are very, very, very scarce resources that are very contested for a lot of values. And even though municipalities have turned to value and promote urban gardening projects, they cannot guarantee the land for projects, right? They cannot guarantee anymore this continuation of the projects towards, for example, not even 10 years, as it used to be the case for allotment gardens. Nowadays, the contracts are renewed every year. And a lot of these projects are actually temporary from the beginning, right? So, what has the municipality resolved or decided? How do municipalities resolve the tension between these pressures, right? They want to promote gardening, but at the same time, they have pressures for other very powerful interests in this land. Well, they've made gardens portable. They provide land temporarily for gardens, and then they provide a different place when that place stops being available. Even this has developed even the possibility of developing projects in small in construction areas that are in process of development for a year, for example. So on the one hand, we have this really emplaced importance for soil, but it's a kind of disemplaced, sort of portable quality to gardens at the same time. So to conclude now here and closing up so I don't make us angry. On the one hand, we have the aesthetic experience of gardening as play that provides this experience of flow where the value for nature in the practice emerges, that comes from the possibility of experimentation, participation with nature, and experiencing the inherent goodness or a balance or a good or a rightness to the practice. And it allows to scale up from the work with the soil to a work of caring for the earth. But at the same time, the historical and institutional context provide this future of uncertainty and collapse that makes them think that, okay, how is it that what I'm doing it fits into a broader future of environmental collapse or of climate change and so on and so forth? Well, it fits in order for us to be able to cope with the apocalypse. And finally, the rules of the game set a certain mobility and portability for gardens that is actually, on the one hand, encouraging understanding gardening, this valuation of gardening as play. Because you can play in different places and you can move the playground to different places without losing the experience of flow. However, it really does undermine projects that have to do with neighborhood and community, and these projects cannot move somewhere else because their basis and their the importance is the place where they are at. So I think that this valuation of gardening as play, as a form of play, is quite interesting in terms of thinking about finding a place in organic processes that is good and right and ethical, but at the same time it can undermine other community values that have traditionally been quite important for urban gardening worldwide. Thank you.